My name is Olivia Bennett, and 3 months ago, I became one of the wealthiest people in Boston without anyone in my family knowing about it. Not my parents, not my siblings, not even my closest friends. The lawyer's office still smells like old leather and mahogany when I close my eyes, and I can still hear Mr. Whitman's voice echoing in that sterile room. Miss Bennett, your grandparents have left you their entire estate. $25 million. I remember sitting there in that burgundy chair, my hands trembling as I held the legal documents that would change everything. The morning sun was streaming through those tall windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rug, and all I could think about was how Grandpa George used to say that money didn't define a person's worth, character, Livy. He'd tell me while we sat on his porch swing in Beacon Hill, that's what matters. Everything else is just paper. But this wasn't just paper. This was $25 million in real estate, investments, and cash that my grandparents had accumulated over 60 years of marriage. The Bennett family fortune that everyone assumed would be divided among their 3 children, my father Edward, my Aunt Margaret, and my Uncle Thomas. Instead, it all went to me, their eldest grandchild, the one they'd always called their special girl. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was their special girl, all right, but not for the reasons they thought. Growing up in our modest 2-story house in Cambridge, I'd always known my grandparents were well off. Their Beacon Hill mansion with its original hardwood floors and crystal chandeliers spoke of old Boston money. Grandma Helen would serve tea in delicate china cups that probably cost more than my monthly rent, while Grandpa George would tell stories about his days in real estate development, back when Boston was rebuilding itself in the 60s and 70s. "We were lucky, dear," Grandma Helen would say, her silver hair perfectly coiffed even at 87. "Your grandfather had an eye for opportunity. He bought properties when everyone else was selling." She'd pat my hand with her soft, wrinkled fingers, and I'd smell her signature lavender perfume that she'd worn for as long as I could remember. My parents always assumed that wealth would eventually trickle down to them. Dad would make comments at family dinners about when the time comes, and Mom would nod knowingly, already planning what they'd do with their share. Pay off the mortgage, maybe buy a vacation home on the Cape, help with my student loans from law school. Normal family dreams built on the expectation of inherited comfort. But my grandparents had other plans. Plans that apparently included keeping their decision completely secret until after they were gone. The reading of the will was supposed to be a family affair. All of us gathered in Mr. Whitman's downtown office on a rainy Tuesday morning in September, 3 days after Grandma Helen's funeral. She'd passed peacefully in her sleep, just 2 months after Grandpa George. She couldn't live without him, my Aunt Margaret had whispered during the service, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Dad wore his best suit, the navy one he'd bought for my law school graduation. Mom had chosen a conservative black dress and her pearl earrings, the ones Grandma Helen had given her for her 50th birthday. My younger brother Jake fidgeted in his chair, probably already calculating how much of his portion he'd use to finally start that restaurant he'd been dreaming about. My sister Emma sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, likely thinking about the children's charity she ran and how much good she could do with unexpected funds. We were all there for the same reason, to hear how our beloved matriarch and patriarch had chosen to divide their legacy among the people they loved most. What we got instead was the shock of our lives. To my granddaughter, Olivia Catherine Bennett, Mr. Whitman had read in his measured, professional tone, "I leave my entire estate, including all properties, investments, and personal effects, totaling approximately $25 million. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the rain pattering against the windows, the distant hum of Boston traffic 12 floors below, and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Dad's face went completely pale, then flushed red. Mom's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. Aunt Margaret actually gasped out loud, her hand flying to her chest. "There must be some mistake," Dad finally managed to say, his voice hoarse. "My parents wouldn't have... they loved all of us equally. But there was no mistake." Mr. Whitman produced document after document, all legally binding, all clearly stating that George and Helen Bennett had chosen to leave everything to me. Not just a portion, everything. The Beacon Hill mansion, the rental properties in Back Bay and the South End, the investment portfolio that had been carefully managed for decades, the family jewelry, the art collection, even the vintage Mercedes that Grandpa George had babied for 30 years. No. When did they make this decision? I heard myself asking. though my voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "The will was updated 2 years ago," Mr. Whitman replied, shuffling through his papers. "Your grandparents were very specific about their intentions. They also left this letter for you, Miss Bennet. They requested that you read it privately." He handed me an envelope with my name written in Grandma Helen's familiar cursive handwriting. The paper was cream-colored and heavy, the kind she used for important correspondence. Inside was a 2-page letter that would haunt me for months to come. "My dearest Olivia," it began, "if you're reading this, then George and I are no longer with you, and you're probably shocked by our decision. We want you to know that this choice wasn't made lightly. We've watched you grow into a remarkable young woman, and we've seen how you've handled challenges that would have broken others your age. Challenges. If only they had known what those challenges really were. You've always been responsible with money, never asking for handouts or expecting things to be given to you. You worked your way through law school. You've built a career on your own merit. And most importantly, you've never lost sight of what truly matters in life. We trust you to use this inheritance wisely, not just for yourself, but for the good of others." The letter went on to explain their reasoning, their hopes for how I'd handle the responsibility, and their absolute confidence that I was the right choice. They mentioned my quiet strength and my compassionate heart, qualities they'd observed during countless family gatherings and private conversations. What they didn't mention, what they couldn't have known, was that their beloved granddaughter, their special girl, had been hiding the most important part of herself from them for over a decade. Sitting in that lawyer's office, surrounded by my devastated family members who couldn't understand why they'd been passed over, I felt the weight of not just $25 million, but of a secret so profound that it would have changed everything my grandparents thought they knew about me. I was gay, had been since I was 17, maybe earlier if I'm being honest with myself, and George and Helen Bennet, products of their generation, devout members of St. Paul's Episcopal Church, would never have understood. They'd loved me as their perfect granddaughter, their shining example of everything a young woman should be. They'd praised my career success, my independence, my decision to focus on my education, rather than rushing into marriage like so many of my cousins. What they'd seen as admirable self-sufficiency was actually me hiding the fact that I'd been in a committed relationship with Sarah Martinez for the past 4 years. Sarah, the brilliant pediatric surgeon who made me laugh until my stomach hurt, who brought me coffee in bed every Sunday morning, who'd been patiently waiting for me to find the courage to introduce her to my family as more than just my roommate. The inheritance letter praised me for being true to my values and living authentically. But the truth was, I'd been living a carefully constructed lie for years. Every family dinner where I deflected questions about dating, every holiday gathering where Sarah had to make excuses not to join us, every time my grandparents asked when I was going to settle down with a nice young man, it was all built on deception. And now they'd left me $25 million based on their perception of who I was, not who I actually was. The meeting ended in chaos. Dad stormed out, muttering something about contesting the will. Mom followed him, her face streaked with tears. Aunt Margaret and Uncle Thomas huddled together, whispering furiously about family loyalty and fairness. Jake just sat there, staring at me like I'd personally stolen his future, while Emma quietly gathered her things and left without saying a word. I was alone in that office with Mr. Whitman, holding legal documents worth more money than I could comprehend, and feeling like the biggest fraud in the world. "Miss Bennet," Mr. Whitman said gently, "I know this is overwhelming. Your grandparents also left instructions for me to help you understand the full scope of the estate and your options going forward. We don't have to discuss details today, but when you're ready." I nodded numbly, tucked the letter and documents into my purse, and walked out into the rain. Boston looked exactly the same as it had that morning. The same brick buildings, the same busy sidewalks, the same gray September sky, but everything felt different. I was different. In the span of 1 hour, I'd gone from being Olivia Bennet, junior associate at Morrison & Associates law firm, to Olivia Bennet, secret millionaire with a secret that felt heavier than ever. The walk back to my apartment in the North End took 45 minutes in the rain, but I needed the time to think. Every step on those familiar cobblestone streets felt like I was carrying the weight of my grandparents' misplaced faith in me. They'd trusted me with their life's work based on an incomplete understanding of who I was, and now I had to figure out what to do with that trust. By the time I reached my building, my shoes were soaked through and my hair was plastered to my head, but I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to tell anyone about the inheritance. Not yet. Not until I figured out how to reconcile the person my grandparents thought they were rewarding with the person I actually was. Sarah was waiting for me when I got home, curled up on our couch with a medical journal and a cup of her favorite chamomile tea. She took one look at me and immediately knew something was wrong. "How did it go?" she asked, setting down her journal and reaching for me. "It was complicated," I said, which was the understatement of the century. She pulled me onto the couch beside her, and I buried my face in her shoulder, breathing in her familiar scent of vanilla and sandalwood. Sarah had been my anchor for 4 years, the one person who knew all of me and loved me anyway. She knew about my complicated relationship with my family, my struggle with coming out, my fear of disappointing the grandparents who'd been such a constant source of love and support in my life. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked, running her fingers through my damp hair. I wanted to tell her everything. About the money, about the letter, about the crushing weight of being trusted with something so massive based on such an incomplete picture of who I was. But the words stuck in my throat. How do you tell the person you love most that you've just inherited enough money to change both your lives forever, but that accepting it feels like betraying everything you've been working toward together? "Maybe later," I said instead, which was what I'd been saying for weeks about a lot of things. Maybe later I'd introduce her to my family as my girlfriend instead of my roommate. Maybe later I'd stop hiding who I was. Maybe later I'd have the courage to live as authentically as my grandparents thought I already did. But later seemed to keep getting further away, and now I had 25 million reasons to keep pushing it back even further. That night, I lay awake listening to Sarah's steady breathing beside me, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. In my purse, just a few feet away, were documents that made me wealthier than I'd ever dreamed of being. But I'd never felt poorer in my life. The inheritance was supposed to be a blessing, a recognition of everything my grandparents had seen in me. Instead, it felt like a test I'd already failed before I even knew I was taking it. The next morning brought reality crashing back in the form of 17 missed calls from my father. I'd turned my phone off after the 4th ring the night before, unable to face the conversations I knew were coming. But sitting at my kitchen table with Sarah making pancakes and humming softly to herself, I couldn't avoid my family forever. "You should probably call him back," Sarah said without turning around, as if she could read my thoughts. She had this uncanny ability to know exactly what I was thinking, which made hiding the inheritance feel even more impossible. I scrolled through the missed calls. Dad, Mom, Dad again, Aunt Margaret, Jake, Dad 3 more times, Uncle Thomas, Emma, the only one who'd called just once, and then Dad again. My voicemail was probably full of increasingly frantic messages. "I know," I said, but made no move toward my phone. Sarah turned around, spatula in hand, wearing my old Harvard Law sweatshirt that was too big for her small frame. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she had that serious expression she got when she was about to say something I needed to hear but didn't want to. "Liv, whatever happened yesterday, you know you can tell me, right? We've been together for 4 years. There's nothing you could say that would change how I feel about you. If only that were true. But how do you tell someone that you've just become incredibly wealthy when you've spent years building a relationship based on equality, on both of you working hard to build your lives together?" Sarah had sacrificed just as much as I had to get through medical school, had worked just as many late nights and weekends to establish her career. The idea of suddenly having access to millions of dollars felt like it would fundamentally alter the balance of everything we'd built. "I know," I said again, which was becoming my default response to everything. "It's just family drama. You know how complicated things get with the Bennetts." She gave me a look that said she knew I was deflecting, but she didn't push. That was one of the things I loved about Sarah. She gave me space to work through things in my own way, even when I was clearly struggling. My phone rang again. "Dad, of course. I have to take this," I said, kissing Sarah's cheek as I walked past her toward the bedroom. Edward Bennett appeared on my screen for the 18th time, and I finally answered. "Hi, Dad." "Olivia, thank God. We need to talk. Can you come over this morning? Your mother's been up all night, and we need to figure out what we're going to do about this situation." "What situation?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. "Don't play dumb with me, Livy. This inheritance thing. There has to be an explanation. Maybe your grandparents were confused, or maybe that lawyer made a mistake reading the documents. We need to sit down as a family and sort this out." I could hear the desperation in his voice, and it broke my heart. Dad had spent his entire adult life expecting that his parents' wealth would eventually provide security for his family. He'd made career choices based on that assumption, turned down higher-paying job opportunities because he knew he didn't need to maximize his earnings. Mom had done the same thing, choosing to work part-time as a librarian so she could be more available for family obligations, confident that their financial future was secure. Dad, I don't think there was a mistake. Mr. Whitman seemed pretty thorough with the documentation. Then why, Olivia? Why would they do this? We're their children. We loved them. We took care of them. We were there for every holiday and birthday and doctor's appointment. What did we do wrong? That was the question that had been keeping me awake all night. What had my parents done wrong? Nothing, as far as I could see. They'd been devoted children, loving and attentive. Dad had handled all of my grandparents' financial affairs for the past 5 years, managing their bills and investments with meticulous care. Mom had been the one to organize their medications, drive them to appointments when they couldn't drive themselves anymore, coordinate with their housekeeper and gardener. My siblings had been just as devoted. Jake visited every Sunday for dinner, regaling them with stories from the restaurant where he worked as a sous chef, and dreaming aloud about opening his own place someday. Emma brought her twin daughters over every weekend, and my grandparents absolutely adored being great-grandparents. Uncle Thomas and Aunt Margaret had been equally attentive, calling daily and including them in every family celebration. We were all good grandchildren, good children. So why had they chosen me? I don't know, Dad. Maybe we should all just take some time to process this before we make any big decisions. Time? His voice rose an octave. Olivia, we're talking about $25 million. That's not the kind of money you just sit on while you process things. Your mother and I have a mortgage. Jake has student loans. Emma's charity barely breaks even. We all had plans, expectations. I understand that, but do you? Do you really understand what this means for the rest of us? Your mother's been crying all night. Jake hasn't spoken a word since we got home yesterday. Emma's trying to put on a brave face, but I can see how hurt she is. This family is falling apart, and you're the only one who can fix it. The weight of his words settled on my chest like a stone. In 24 hours, I'd gone from being just another member of the Bennett family to being the one person who could either heal or destroy everything we'd built together. The irony was staggering. I was being asked to save a family that didn't even really know who I was. Can you just come over this morning, please? We need to talk about this as a family. I looked through the bedroom door at Sarah, who was plating pancakes and probably wondering why I was having such an intense conversation before 9 a.m. on a Wednesday. I thought about the documents in my purse, about the responsibility that now sat squarely on my shoulders, about the letter from my grandparents praising me for qualities they wouldn't have seen if they'd known the whole truth about my life. Okay, I said finally. I'll be there in an hour. Thank you, sweetheart. And Olivia, we'll figure this out together, okay? Family comes first. Family comes first. That had been the Bennett family motto for as long as I could remember. It's what my grandparents had drilled into all of us, the principle that guided every major decision we made. But how do you put family first when being honest with your family might destroy everything? Sarah was waiting for me when I came back to the kitchen. 2 plates of perfectly golden pancakes on the table along with fresh strawberries and real maple syrup. "Mun, everything okay?" she asked, though she could clearly see it wasn't. "My parents want me to come over. Family meeting about the will. That sounds intense. Do you want me to come with you for moral support?" The offer was tempting, but bringing Sarah to my parents and house would raise questions I wasn't ready to answer. My family knew about her, of course. She'd been to a few family gatherings over the years, carefully introduced as my friend from law school, and later, my roommate. But there was a difference between knowing Sarah existed and understanding her actual role in my life. "Thanks, but I think this is something I need to handle on my own." Sarah nodded, but I could see the hurt flash across her face. 4 years of being relegated to the sidelines of my family life had taken its toll on her, though she rarely complained about it directly. She'd made subtle comments here and there, gentle suggestions that maybe it was time to be more open with my family, that maybe they'd be more accepting than I thought. But Sarah hadn't grown up in Boston in a family where tradition and appearances mattered as much as they did to the Bennetts. She hadn't listened to years of casual comments about alternative lifestyles and the importance of marriage between a man and woman. She hadn't seen the way my grandparents' faces changed whenever they encountered anything that challenged their deeply held beliefs about how families should look. I grabbed my keys and purse, pausing at the door to look back at Sarah. She was sitting at our table, eating pancakes alone, looking small and vulnerable in my oversized sweatshirt. I love you, I said suddenly, needing her to know that whatever else was happening, that hadn't changed. Her face brightened immediately. I love you too. Call me if you need anything, okay? The drive to my parents' one house in Cambridge took 30 minutes through morning traffic, giving me plenty of time to rehearse conversations I didn't want to have. I passed familiar landmarks, the coffee shop where I'd studied for the bar exam, the park where we'd had family picnics when I was younger, the church where my grandparents had been married 63 years ago. Everything looked normal, but I felt like I was seeing it all through different eyes. My childhood home was a modest colonial with white shutters and a red door, surrounded by the maple trees my dad had planted when I was 10. It looked exactly the same as it always had, but walking up the front path felt like approaching foreign territory. Mom opened the door before I could knock, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She pulled me into a tight hug that lasted longer than usual, as if she was afraid I might disappear. I'm so glad you're here, honey. We need to figure this out together. Dad was waiting in the living room, pacing back and forth in front of the fireplace. The room looked like it had been hit by a tornado. Papers scattered across the coffee table, photo albums open on the couch, boxes pulled out from the closet. It looked like they'd been going through every family document they owned, searching for some clue that might explain my grandparents' decision. Sit down, Livy, Dad said, gesturing to my usual spot on the sofa. And we've been doing some thinking, and we have some theories about what might have happened. I sat down carefully, noticing that they'd pulled out photo albums from every major family event of the past decade. Pictures of graduations, birthdays, holidays, weddings, a visual timeline of our family history. Look at this, Mom said, settling beside me and opening one of the albums. This is from Emma's wedding 5 years ago. See how you're standing right next to Grandpa George. And here, from Jake's graduation, you're helping Grandma Helen with her purse. And this one, from last Christmas. She flipped through page after page of photos, each one showing me in close proximity to my grandparents, often helping them with something or engaged in conversation, while other family members were focused on their own activities. We think maybe they got confused about your role in their lives, Dad said, still pacing. You were always so attentive to them, so responsible. Maybe they started to think of you more as a caregiver than a granddaughter, and they felt like they owed you something. I stared at the photos, seeing our family history through their eyes. There I was at dozens of gatherings, the dutiful granddaughter who always made sure my grandparents had everything they needed. The one who remembered to bring Grandma Helen's favorite tea to family dinners, who helped Grandpa George with his crossword puzzles, who stayed late to help clean up after every celebration. But what my parents were seeing as evidence of special treatment, I was seeing as something else entirely. In every single photo, I was alone with my grandparents or focused entirely on them, never fully integrated with the rest of the family activities. While my cousins and siblings were laughing together or engaged in group conversations, I was always slightly apart, always playing the role of the devoted but solitary granddaughter. Had my grandparents noticed that too? Had they seen something in my careful distance from romantic relationships, my focus on career over family life, that resonated with their own experience of feeling different or set apart? Or maybe, Mom continued, they were worried about your future. You know, you're 31 and you're still single. Maybe they thought you needed the financial security more than the rest of us because you don't have a husband to take care of you. The irony of that statement hit me like a physical blow. Here was my mother, trying to rationalize my inheritance by assuming I was lonely and unloved, when the truth was, I'd been in the most loving, stable relationship of my life for 4 years. I had someone who took care of me, who supported my dreams, who made me laugh every single day, but my family had no idea she existed as anything more than a friend. That's possible, I said carefully, because I didn't know what else to say. The point is, Dad said, stopping his pacing to face me directly, whatever their reasoning was, we don't think they intended to cut the rest of us out completely. They loved all of us. This has to be some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. So what are you suggesting? We want you to split the inheritance, Mom said quickly, as if she'd been waiting for me to ask. Not necessarily equally. We understand that they wanted you to have the largest portion, but maybe you could take half, and the rest of us could split the other half. That seems more in line with what they would have actually wanted. Or, Dad added, maybe you could put most of it in a family trust, something that benefits everyone but recognizes your special place in their hearts. I looked around the room at all the scattered documents and photos, evidence of my parents' desperate attempt to make sense of a decision that had blindsided them completely. They weren't being greedy or unreasonable. They were just trying to reconcile their understanding of their parents with a reality that didn't match their expectations. "I need some time to think about all of this," I said finally. "Time?" Dad's voice rose again. "Olivia, every day we wait is another day this family is torn apart. Jake won't even return my calls. Emma's putting on a brave face, but I can tell she's devastated. Margaret and Thomas are talking about hiring a lawyer to contest the will. They want to contest it. Can you blame them? From their perspective, their parents just wrote them out of their lives completely. $25 million, Olivia. That's not just money. That's a statement about who mattered and who didn't." The guilt was crushing. Here I was, the accidental heir to a fortune I'd never asked for, watching my family disintegrate because of a decision I'd had nothing to do with. And underneath it all was the nagging knowledge that maybe, just maybe, my grandparents had seen something in me that I'd been too afraid to acknowledge even to myself. "What if I don't want the money?" I asked suddenly. My parents stared at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. "What do you mean?" Mom asked. "What if I just give it all away? Donate it to charity or something? Then nobody gets it, so nobody can feel left out." "Absolutely not," Dad said immediately. "That money represents your grandparents' life work. You can't just throw it away because the situation is complicated. They wanted it to stay in the family. But if they wanted it to stay in the family, why didn't they leave it to the family?" "Because they made a mistake," Mom said firmly. Or because they were getting old and confused, or because someone influenced them. But that doesn't mean we should compound that mistake by letting their legacy disappear completely. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the situation settling over all of us. Outside, I could hear the familiar sounds of our neighborhood. Kids playing in yards, cars pulling into driveways, dogs barking. Normal life continuing while our family dealt with this extraordinary circumstance. "There's something else," Mom said finally, reaching for another photo album. "We found these yesterday while we were going through old pictures." She opened the album to a section I'd never seen before, filled with photos of me at various ages. Not family group photos, but pictures that had clearly been taken specifically of me. Me at age 5, reading in my grandparents' library. Me at 10, helping Grandpa George in his garden. Me at 15, playing piano at their house while they watched from the doorway. Me at 20, graduating from college, with them beaming proudly in the audience. "Look at how they documented your life," Mom said softly. "This wasn't just about you being helpful or responsible. They were watching you grow up in a way they weren't watching the other grandchildren. They were invested in you specifically." I touched one of the photos. Me at 25, the day I passed the bar exam. My grandparents had insisted on taking me to dinner to celebrate, just the 3 of us. In the photo, I'm holding my certificate while they stand on either side of me, looking like they'd just witnessed the most important moment in history. "Maybe," Dad said quietly. "They saw something in you that reminded them of themselves. You know, Grandpa George always talked about how he had to work harder than everyone else to prove himself in business, how he had to be smarter, more dedicated, more focused than his competitors. And Grandma Helen always said she had to be twice as good as other women to be taken seriously in her volunteer work. They admired people who overcame challenges," Mom added. "Well, maybe they saw you working so hard to build your career, putting your professional life ahead of everything else, and they identified with that sacrifice." Sacrifice. That word hit me harder than any of the others, because the truth was, I had been sacrificing, just not in the way they thought. I'd been sacrificing authenticity for acceptance, hiding my true self to maintain my place in a family that might not love me if they knew who I really was. And somehow, without even knowing it, my grandparents had recognized that sacrifice and rewarded it with their entire fortune. I left my parents' house that morning with more questions than answers, and a promise to think seriously about their proposal to split the inheritance. The drive back to my apartment felt like navigating through fog, everything familiar yet somehow distorted by the weight of decisions I wasn't ready to make. Sarah was gone when I got home, already at the hospital for her afternoon shift, but she'd left a note on the kitchen counter. "Whatever you're going through, we'll figure it out together. Love you. S." The simple words brought tears to my eyes because they highlighted exactly what I'd been denying both of us, the chance to actually figure things out together. I spent the rest of the day trying to work, but I couldn't concentrate on legal briefs when my entire life had been turned upside down. Instead, I found myself going through old photos on my laptop, looking for clues about my relationship with my grandparents that I might have missed. There they were, hundreds of images spanning nearly 3 decades, birthday parties where Grandpa George would always seek me out for special conversations, holiday gatherings where Grandma Helen would pull me aside to ask about my dreams and ambitions, family vacations where they'd insist I sit with them at dinner, wanting to hear about my latest achievements or challenges. But looking at these photos with fresh eyes, I started to notice something else. In almost every picture from the past 10 years, I looked slightly uncomfortable, like I was performing rather than simply being myself. My smile was always perfect, my posture always proper, my responses always exactly what everyone wanted to hear. I'd become so practiced at being the perfect granddaughter that I'd forgotten what it felt like to just be myself around my family. The revelation hit me around 4 o'clock, while I was staring at a picture from last year's Thanksgiving dinner. There I was, sitting between my grandparents, laughing at something Grandpa George had said, but if you looked closely, you could see the tension in my shoulders, the careful way I held myself apart from everyone else. They hadn't just loved me, they'd recognized something in me that even I was still learning to understand. The careful distance I maintained from romantic relationships, the way I threw myself into my career with single-minded determination, the subtle sadness that probably crept into my eyes when family conversations turned to marriage and children and conventional life paths. They'd seen someone struggling to find her place in the world, and they'd wanted to give me the freedom to figure it out on my own terms. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Emma's name appeared on the screen. "Hi, Em." "Hey, Liv. Can you talk for a minute?" Emma had always been my closest sibling, just 2 years younger than me, and infinitely wiser about navigating family dynamics. While Jake wore his emotions on his sleeve and could never hide what he was thinking, Emma had inherited Mom's diplomatic nature and Dad's strategic mind. "Of course. How are you holding up?" "I'm okay. Confused, but okay. Listen, I wanted to talk to you before things get any more complicated than they already are." "What do you mean?" "Dad called me this morning. He said you might be willing to split the inheritance. But he also mentioned that Margaret and Thomas are talking about contesting the will. If they actually go through with that, this whole thing could get really ugly really fast." I hadn't considered the legal implications of a will contest. As a lawyer, I should have thought about it immediately, but I'd been too emotionally overwhelmed to think clearly about the practical aspects of the situation. How serious are they about contesting it? Serious enough that Margaret already called a lawyer. She's convinced that Grandma and Grandpa weren't in their right minds when they made the will, or that someone, meaning you, somehow manipulated them into changing it. That's ridiculous. I had no idea about any of this until yesterday. I know that, and I think most of the family knows that too. But Margaret's hurt, and when she's hurt, she gets vindictive. You remember what happened when Uncle Thomas got divorced and she took his ex-wife's side just to spite him? I did remember. Aunt Margaret had a long history of turning family disagreements into full-scale wars, complete with choosing sides and holding grudges that lasted for years. The idea of her directing that energy toward me made my stomach turn. What does Uncle Thomas think? He's torn. On one hand, he's as shocked as everyone else about being left out. On the other hand, he's always been fond of you, and he knows how close you were to Grandma and Grandpa. I think he could be convinced to let this go if he felt like there was some fairness in how things get resolved. And you, how do you feel about all of this? Emma was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear her daughters playing in the background, the innocent laughter of children who had no idea their family was in crisis. Honestly, I'm hurt. I won't lie about that. But I'm also trying to understand why they made this choice. Grandma and Grandpa weren't impulsive people. They thought about everything carefully, especially financial decisions. If they left everything to you, they had a reason. But what reason could possibly justify leaving their own children with nothing? Maybe they didn't see it as leaving us with nothing. Maybe they saw it as trusting you to take care of all of us. You know how they always talked about family responsibility, about the older generation looking out for the younger one. Maybe they saw you as the next family matriarch. The idea was terrifying. Me, as the Bennett family matriarch, the keeper of family traditions and values that I wasn't even sure I believed in, the person responsible for maintaining connections and relationships that I'd been carefully managing and compartmentalizing for years. I don't think I'm qualified for that job, Em. Neither was Grandma Helen when Grandpa George's parents died and left them everything. But she grew into it. Maybe they thought you would too. We talked for another 20 minutes, with Emma carefully probing to understand my thoughts about the inheritance without putting pressure on me to make immediate decisions. It was a delicate balance, and she handled it with the same grace she brought to her work with children's charities. asking the right questions without being pushy, offering support without being patronizing. "There's one more thing," she said, as we were wrapping up the conversation. "I think you should talk to Jake before you make any decisions about splitting the inheritance." "Why? Is he okay?" "He's struggling. This whole thing has really shaken him up. You know how he's always felt like the family screw-up, like he never quite measured up to what everyone expected. Finding out that you inherited everything while he got nothing has really reinforced those feelings. Jake had always been the most sensitive of us, the one who took things personally, even when they weren't meant that way. Growing up, he'd struggled academically while Emma and I excelled, and he'd never quite found his footing professionally the way we had. He'd dropped out of college twice before finally finishing with a degree in culinary arts, and even then, he'd bounced between restaurant jobs for years before finding his current position. I should call him. You should. But Liv, be prepared. He's pretty angry right now, and he might say things he doesn't mean. After Emma hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment trying to work up the courage to call my brother. Through the windows, I could see Boston Harbor in the distance, the late afternoon sun reflecting off the water in a way that reminded me of countless family trips to the waterfront when we were kids. Simpler times, when our biggest worry was whether we'd have enough quarters for the arcade games at Quincy Market. I was still staring at my phone when it rang. Jake's name appeared on the screen. "Hi, Jake." "Don't hi, Jake and me. We need to talk." His voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Harder, colder. Jake had always been the peacemaker in our family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and found ways to make everyone laugh when things got tense. This version of my brother was foreign to me. "Okay, what do you want to talk about?" "Oh, I don't know. How about the fact that you just became a multimillionaire while the rest of us got screwed over? How about the fact that our grandparents apparently loved you more than they loved their own children? How about the fact that you're sitting there acting all innocent like this is just some big surprise when you probably knew it was coming?" "Jake, I swear to you, I had no idea." "Bullshit, Olivia. Nobody gets surprised with $25 million. You had to know something. All those private conversations with them, all those times you stayed late after family dinners to help clean up. What were you really doing? Were you working on them? Convincing them that the rest of us didn't care about them as much as you did?" The accusation stung because it was so far from the truth, but I could hear the pain underneath his anger. Jake wasn't really mad about the money. He was hurt by what he saw as evidence that our grandparents had valued me more than him. "I never tried to influence them, Jake. I stayed late because I enjoyed talking to them, because they were interesting people with amazing stories. I helped clean up because that's what you do when you love someone." "Right. And the rest of us? What? We didn't love them enough. We didn't care about their stories." Emma brought her kids over every weekend. I had dinner with them every Sunday. Mom drove them to every doctor's appointment for the past 5 years. But somehow you're the one who really loved them. That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying, Olivia? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you played the perfect granddaughter card for years, and now you're cashing in while the rest of us get to explain to our kids why great-grandma and great-grandpa didn't think they were worth remembering. That hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't thought about how this would affect the next generation. Emma's twin daughters, who were only 8 years old and wouldn't understand why their great-great-grandparents had excluded them from their legacy, or the children Jake hoped to have someday, who would grow up hearing about the Bennett family fortune that went to their aunt, instead of being shared among all the grandchildren. "Jake, I'm going to figure out a way to make this fair for everyone. I promise." "How?" "You can give us money, sure, but you can't give us back what we've lost. You can't undo the message this sends about who mattered and who didn't. You think I want your charity? You think any of us want to be dependent on your generosity for the rest of our lives? It wouldn't be charity. It would be exactly charity. Because no matter how you slice it up, no matter how generous you are with your unexpected windfall, the reality is that our grandparents chose you over all of us. They trusted you with their life's work, while they left the rest of us with nothing. That's not something money can fix." He was right, and we both knew it, even if I split the inheritance equally among all of us. The damage to our family relationships had already been done. The message had been sent, and it couldn't be unsent. "I don't know how to fix this," I admitted. "Maybe you can't. Maybe this is just who we are now. The family where one person got everything and everyone else got screwed. Maybe that's your grandparents. Real legacy." The line went quiet for a moment, and when Jake spoke again, his voice was softer but somehow more devastating. "You know what the worst part is, Liv? I actually looked up to you growing up. You were the smart one, the successful one, the one who had everything figured out. I used to tell people that my sister was going to be somebody important someday. And now I don't even know who you are." He hung up before I could respond, leaving me sitting alone in my apartment with the weight of his words crushing down on me. In the space of 48 hours, I'd gone from being a beloved member of the Bennett family to being the person who might destroy it completely. Sarah came home around 7, exhausted from a long day of surgery, but immediately alert when she saw my face. "What happened?" she asked, dropping her medical bag and coming to sit beside me on the couch. "My family is falling apart, and it's my fault. I seriously doubt that's true. Tell me what happened." So I did. I told her about the phone calls, about my parents, desperate attempts to rationalize the inheritance, about Emma's careful diplomacy and Jake's devastating anger. I told her about the photos my parents had found, about my aunt's plans to contest the will, about the impossible position I'd been put in. What I didn't tell her was about the money. $25 million sat there between us, an invisible wall that I'd built by keeping the secret. Every time she offered comfort or advice, I wanted to confess everything, but I couldn't find the words. "Maybe," Sarah said carefully, "this is the universe telling you it's time to be more open with your family about who you really are." "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe the reason you feel so guilty about this inheritance is because you've been hiding such a big part of yourself from them. Maybe if they knew the real you, all of you, they'd understand better why your grandparents made this choice." She was right, of course, but the thought of coming out to my family in the middle of this crisis felt like adding gasoline to a fire. How do you tell your parents that their perfect daughter is gay while they're still processing the fact that she's inherited millions of dollars? How do you introduce your girlfriend to a family that's already questioning everything they thought they knew about you? "I don't think this is the right time," I said. Sarah pulled back slightly, and I could see the hurt in her eyes. "When is the right time, Liv? We've been together for 4 years. I've been patient. I've understood your need for privacy. But at some point, don't you think your family deserves to know who I actually am to you?" "Of course. But what? There's always going to be some crisis. Some reason why it's not the perfect moment. Your grandfather's heart attack, your cousin's wedding, your brother's job troubles, and now this. There's never going to be a perfect time, so maybe we should just pick an imperfect one and be honest." She was asking for something I'd been promising her for years, the chance to be acknowledged as my partner, not just my roommate, the chance to attend family gatherings as herself, not as a carefully managed secret, the chance to build a real relationship with the people I claim to love most in the world. "What if they don't accept it?" I asked quietly. "Then at least you'll know where you stand. But what if they do? What if all this time you've been protecting them from a truth they're actually ready to hear?" I thought about my grandparents' letter, about their praise for my authenticity and my courage to live according to my values. What would they have thought if they'd known the truth about my relationship with Sarah? Would they have been disappointed? Or would they have respected me for finding love even when it didn't fit the traditional mold they'd grown up with? "I need some time to think about all of this," I said, which had become my standard response to everything. Sarah nodded, but I could see the resignation in her expression. 4 years of needing time had taken its toll on her patience, and I was running out of chances to make things right. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to Sarah's breathing, and trying to imagine a future where all my secrets were out in the open, a future where my family knew about the inheritance and about my relationship and about all the ways I'd been carefully curating their perception of me. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. But before I could even begin to think about coming out to my family, I needed to figure out what to do with $25 million and the expectations that came with it, because no matter what other secrets I was keeping, the money was the immediate crisis that needed to be addressed, and I was running out of time to address it. The crisis came to a head 2 weeks later, on a rainy Thursday morning that started like any other, but ended up changing everything. I was in my office at Morrison & Associates, trying to focus on a contract dispute case, when my assistant knocked on my door with an expression I'd never seen before, part confusion, part concern, and something that looked almost like awe. "Ms. Bennett, there's a Margaret Sullivan here to see you. She says she's your aunt, and she has a lawyer with her." My blood went cold. Aunt Margaret had made good on her threat to contest the will, and apparently she'd decided to confront me directly before filing any paperwork. "Send them in," I said, closing the file I'd been pretending to read. Aunt Margaret walked into my office looking like she was preparing for battle. She wore her most severe black suit, the one she reserved for funerals and formal occasions, and her silver hair was pulled back so tightly it looked painful. Behind her was a man I didn't recognize, tall, expensively dressed, carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Olivia," Aunt Margaret said, settling into one of my client chairs without waiting to be invited. "This is Richard Hartwell, my attorney. We need to talk." I gestured for them both to sit, though Margaret had already made herself comfortable. Hartwell remained standing, positioning himself slightly behind Margaret's chair, in what I recognized as a classic intimidation tactic. "What can I do for you, Aunt Margaret? You can stop pretending that you had nothing to do with my parents' decision to disinherit their own children," she said without preamble. "Richard here has been looking into the circumstances surrounding the will, and we've discovered some very interesting information." Hartwell opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Ms. Bennett, my client has reason to believe that you exercised undue influence over George and Helen Bennett in the months leading up to their deaths. We have documentation showing that you visited them frequently, often alone, and that you were present during at least 2 meetings with their attorney. I visited them because I loved them," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "And I was never present during any meetings with their attorney." "Really?" Margaret leaned forward, her eyes sharp with accusation. "Because Mr. Whitman's appointment calendar shows that you were at his office with my parents on March 15th and again on April 22nd. Both dates were within the time frame when they were revising their will." I searched my memory, trying to remember those dates. March 15th. That was the day Grandpa George had asked me to drive him to what I thought was a doctor's appointment. But when we'd arrived at the downtown office building, he'd asked me to wait in the lobby while he went upstairs for what he called boring business stuff. April 22nd had been similar. Grandma Helen had needed a ride to meet with someone about paperwork, and I'd spent an hour in a waiting room reading magazines while she handled what she described as tedious estate planning details. "I drove them to appointments," I said. "I had no idea they were meeting with their lawyer, and I certainly wasn't involved in any discussions about their will." "How convenient," Margaret said coldly. "You just happened to be their chauffeur on the exact days they were cutting their own children out of their inheritance." Hartwell pulled out more documents. "We also have evidence that you had extensive private conversations with the deceased in the weeks following these meetings. Phone records show daily calls between your number and their home number, some lasting over an hour. We talked every day because we enjoyed each other's company. That's what families do." "Is it?" Margaret's voice rose slightly. "Because none of the rest of us had daily hour-long conversations with them. None of us were present during their legal meetings. None of us mysteriously became the sole beneficiary of $25 million. The accusation hung in the air between us. I could see where this was going. They were building a case that I had systematically isolated my grandparents from the rest of the family and manipulated them into changing their will in my favor." "What exactly are you accusing me of, Aunt Margaret?" "I'm not accusing you of anything yet," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I'm giving you an opportunity to do the right thing before this gets ugly. Richard believes we have a strong case for undue influence. The court would invalidate the will and distribute the estate according to Massachusetts intestacy laws, which means it would go to their children, where it belongs. But that's not what they wanted." "How do you know what they wanted?" Margaret snapped. "Did they tell you directly that they intended to disinherit their own children? Did they explain why 3 people who loved and cared for them for 60 years deserved nothing while their granddaughter deserved everything?" I thought about my grandparents' letter, still locked in my desk drawer at home. They had explained their reasoning, at least partially, but how could I share that explanation without revealing the secrets that had led to their decision? "They left a letter," I said carefully. "They explained that they trusted me to use the inheritance responsibly." "A letter that conveniently only you have seen," Hartwell interjected. "A letter that was written by 2 elderly people who may not have fully understood the implications of their decisions." "They understood perfectly well." "Did they?" Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying my face. "Because I've been thinking about this for 2 weeks now, and something's been bothering me." "Why you, Olivia? What made you so special that they would abandon their own children for you?" The question hit closer to home than she could possibly know. Because the truth was, I didn't fully understand their reasoning either. Yes, I'd been attentive and devoted, but so had other family members. Yes, I'd been responsible with money, but so had my parents. The only thing that truly set me apart was the secret I'd been keeping, and the possibility that somehow, on some level, they'd recognized my struggle even without knowing the details. I don't know, I admitted. I've been trying to understand it myself. Margaret studied my face for a long moment, and I could see her trying to read between the lines. She'd always been perceptive, quick to pick up on family undercurrents and hidden tensions. There's something you're not telling me, she said finally. Something about your relationship with my parents that's different from what the rest of us had. She was right, of course. But how could I explain that the difference wasn't manipulation or scheming? It was the weight of carrying secrets that my grandparents had somehow sensed without understanding. The bottom line, Hartwell said, stepping forward, is that my client is prepared to file a will contest unless you agree to a reasonable settlement. We're not trying to cut you out completely. We recognize that your grandparents clearly intended for you to receive something, but $25 million while their children get nothing. That's not reasonable, and it's not what loving parents would have wanted. What are you proposing? Margaret opened her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. We've drawn up a proposal for how the estate should be divided. You would receive $5 million, more than generous for a grandchild. The remaining $20 million would be split equally among my father's 3 children. Everyone gets something. Everyone's acknowledged. And this family doesn't tear itself apart over money. $5 million. 6 months ago, I would have considered that an unimaginable fortune. Now, after 2 weeks of carrying the weight of $25 million, it felt like being asked to give up something that had never really belonged to me in the first place. I need time to consider this, I said. How much time? Hartwell asked. Because if we don't have an agreement within 72 hours, we'll be filing our contest. And once that happens, all of this becomes public record. Your colleagues will know. Your friends will know. The entire Boston legal community will know that the Bennett family is fighting over money. The threat was clear. Not only would they challenge the will, but they'd make sure the proceedings were as public and embarrassing as possible. My law firm prided itself on discretion and professionalism. Having a partner embroiled in a messy family inheritance dispute wouldn't exactly enhance my career prospects. 72 hours, Margaret repeated, standing up. That's reasonable, considering you've already had 2 weeks to think about this. They left me sitting in my office, staring at their proposal and feeling like the walls were closing in around me. $5 million to avoid destroying my family and my professional reputation. It seemed like an easy choice, except for one nagging detail. My grandparents had specifically chosen to give me everything, and by accepting Margaret's proposal, I'd be overriding their clearly stated wishes. I tried to focus on work for the rest of the morning, but it was hopeless. Every time I looked at a legal document, I thought about wills and inheritance law. Every time my phone rang, I wondered if it was another family member calling to weigh in on the situation. By lunchtime, I was so distracted that I gave up pretending to be productive and decided to go home. The apartment felt different when I walked in, though I couldn't immediately put my finger on why. Sarah wasn't supposed to be home. Her shift didn't end until 6, but I could hear movement in the bedroom. "Sarah?" I called out. "In here," she replied, but her voice sounded strange. I found her in our bedroom, packing clothes into a suitcase I'd never seen before. "What's going on?" I asked, though the sinking feeling in my stomach suggested I already knew. Sarah turned to face me, and I could see she'd been crying. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she was clutching one of my t-shirts like it was a lifeline. "I can't do this anymore, Liv." "Do what?" "This, us. Living in limbo while you figure out whether your family is more important to you than I am." I sat down on the edge of the bed, watching her fold clothes with mechanical precision. "Sarah, that's not fair. You know you're important to me." "Do I?" "Because for the past 2 weeks, you've been dealing with some major family crisis that you won't even tell me about. You disappear for hours at a time, you're constantly on the phone with people you won't name, and when I try to support you, you shut me out." She was right. I'd been so focused on managing the inheritance crisis that I'd been treating her like a roommate instead of a partner. But how could I explain that I'd been trying to protect her from the chaos of my family situation? It's complicated. Everything's always complicated with you, Olivia. Your family is complicated. Your feelings are complicated. Your relationship with your own identity is complicated. But you know what's not complicated? Love. Either you love me enough to include me in your life completely, or you don't. She zipped up the suitcase and turned to face me fully. I got offered a position at Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, head of pediatric cardiac surgery. It's an incredible opportunity, and I've been waiting for the right time to tell you about it. When? They need an answer by the end of the week. If I take it, I'd start in a month. The timeline hit me like a physical blow. End of the week. The same deadline Margaret had given me for deciding about the inheritance. Everything in my life was suddenly converging into one impossible moment of choice. "What about us?" I asked. "That's up to you. I've been thinking about this for months. Liv, I love you, but I can't keep living in the shadows of your life. If you want to be with me, really be with me, then come to Philadelphia. Leave Boston. Leave your family's expectations, and let's build something real together." I can't just leave everything. Why not? What's really keeping you here? A job you could do anywhere. A family that doesn't even know who you really are. A city full of memories of hiding who you are. She sat down beside me on the bed, taking my hands in hers. "Liv, I've watched you struggle with this for 4 years. You're so afraid of disappointing people that you've forgotten how to disappoint them in service of your own happiness. Your grandparents left you that inheritance because they saw something special in you. But maybe what they saw was your potential to break free from all the expectations that have been holding you back." It was the first time she'd directly referenced the inheritance, and I realized she'd known about it all along. "How long have you known?" "I figured it out after that first family meeting. You came home looking like someone had handed you both a winning lottery ticket and a death sentence. Plus, you've been acting like someone carrying the weight of the world for 2 weeks. Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I was waiting for you to trust me enough to tell me yourself. But it's been 2 weeks. Liv, 2 weeks of watching you struggle with something we could have been working through together." Sarah stood up and pulled the suitcase off the bed. "I'm going to stay at my sister's place for a few days while I make my decision about Philadelphia. If you want to talk, really talk, about all of it, you know where to find me." She paused at the bedroom door, looking back at me with an expression that broke my heart. "I love you, Olivia Bennett. All of you, including the parts you're afraid to show the world. But I can't love you enough for both of us. At some point, you have to decide whether you're brave enough to love yourself." And then she was gone, leaving me alone in our apartment, with her words echoing in my ears and the weight of 2 impossible deadlines pressing down on me. 72 hours to decide whether to give up most of my inheritance to keep my family together. 1 week to decide whether to follow the woman I love to Philadelphia or stay in Boston and continue living a carefully curated version of my life. I sat in our empty bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of Sarah's departure, and realized that for the first time in my adult life, I was going to have to choose authenticity over safety. The question was whether I was brave enough to handle the consequences. My phone rang, interrupting my spiraling thoughts. Emma's name appeared on the screen. "Hi, Em. Liv. Thank God. We need to talk. Margaret just called Dad, and apparently she's planning to contest the will. But that's not the worst part." "What's the worst part?" "Jake's been drinking since yesterday. He showed up at Mom and Dad's house this morning, completely drunk, talking about how the family doesn't care about him and how he's never been good enough for any of us. Mom's beside herself. Dad's talking about driving him to rehab, and everyone's blaming you for triggering all of this." The guilt was crushing. In trying to protect my family from the truth about the inheritance, I'd created a situation that was destroying them anyway. Where is he now? Dad took him home to sleep it off. But Liv, this is bad. Really bad. Jake's been struggling with depression for months, and this inheritance thing has pushed him over the edge. He keeps saying that Grandma and Grandpa's decision proves that he's worthless, that even his own family doesn't believe in him. I thought about my gentle, sensitive brother, who'd spent his whole life feeling like he didn't measure up to everyone else's expectations. The inheritance had confirmed his worst fears about himself, and I was the one carrying the evidence that might prove him wrong. "Emma, I need to tell you something. Can you come over? Now? Now. And bring Jake if he's sober enough. There are things about this whole situation that I haven't told anyone, and it's time for the truth to come out." "What kind of things?" I looked around my empty apartment, at the space Sarah and I had shared for 2 years, at the life I'd built on a foundation of carefully managed secrets. "Everything," I said. "It's time to tell everyone everything." 3 hours later, my apartment was fuller than it had been in months. Emma had arrived first, with Jake in tow, looking pale and shaky but sober. Mom and Dad had come together, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion. Even Uncle Thomas had shown up, apparently called by Emma, who told everyone that I had something important to say about the inheritance. The only person missing was Aunt Margaret, who had refused Emma's invitation with a curt message that she'd said everything she needed to say this morning. They sat around my living room like mourners at a wake, all of them looking at me with expressions ranging from hope to suspicion to barely contained anger. Jake slumped in the corner chair, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Mom kept glancing around the apartment as if she was seeing it for the first time, probably wondering why Sarah's belongings were noticeably absent. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice shakier than I'd intended. "I know this has been an incredibly difficult time for our family, and I know that a lot of you are angry with me about the inheritance. But there are things you don't know, things I should have told you years ago, that might help explain why Grandma and Grandpa made the choice they did." I pulled out the letter from my grandparents, the one I'd been carrying like a talisman for 2 weeks. "First, I want you to know that I had absolutely no idea about their decision until Mr. Whitman read the will. I was as shocked as all of you were. But they did leave me a letter explaining their reasoning, and I think you should hear what they wrote." I read the letter aloud, every word about responsibility and trust and living authentically. When I finished, the room was quiet, except for the sound of Mom quietly crying. "They saw something in you," Dad said finally, his voice hoarse, something they didn't see in the rest of us. "Yes, they did. But not what you think." I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. "The thing is, Grandma and Grandpa thought they were rewarding me for living authentically and staying true to my values. But the truth is, I've been lying to all of you for years about the most important part of my life." Emma leaned forward. "What do you mean?" I thought about Sarah, probably sitting in her sister's apartment right now, wondering if I was brave enough to finally tell the truth. I thought about my grandparents, who had somehow seen through my carefully constructed facade to the person struggling underneath. I thought about Jake, drowning in self-doubt because he didn't understand that the inheritance had nothing to do with our relative worth as grandchildren. "I'm gay," I said simply. "I have been since I was 17, maybe longer. And for the past 4 years, I've been in a relationship with Sarah Martinez. Not as roommates, not as friends, as partners. She's the love of my life, and none of you have ever known her as anything more than the woman who occasionally shows up to family gatherings and stays carefully in the background." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the distant sound of traffic outside, my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Mom spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah is your girlfriend. She's more than that. She's my partner in every sense of the word. We've lived together for 2 years. We've talked about marriage, about building a life together. She's been patient and understanding about my need to keep our relationship private, but that patience has limits." "Where is she now?" Emma asked gently. "She left this morning. She got offered a job in Philadelphia, and she's tired of living in the shadows of my life. She gave me a choice. Come with her and start fresh somewhere we can be ourselves, or stay here and keep pretending to be someone I'm not." Jake looked up for the first time since I'd started talking. "Is this why you never dated anyone? Why you always deflected when we asked about your love life?" "Yes. I've been so afraid of disappointing all of you, so terrified of being rejected or judged, that I built this whole elaborate version of myself that I thought you'd find acceptable. The successful lawyer, the responsible granddaughter, the woman who was too focused on her career to bother with romance. It was all true, but it wasn't the whole truth." Dad was staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "How long have you felt this way?" "About women, I mean, since I was a teenager, maybe longer. I remember having crushes on girls in high school and thinking there was something wrong with me. I dated a few boys in college because that's what was expected, but it never felt right. It wasn't until I met Sarah in law school that I finally understood who I really was." "Why didn't you tell us?" Mom asked, and I could hear the hurt in her voice. "We love you, Olivia. Nothing could change that. I was scared. You all had these expectations of who I was supposed to be, and I didn't want to disappoint you. Grandma and Grandpa especially. They were so traditional, so focused on family values and conventional paths. I convinced myself that they would never understand, but they left you everything," Uncle Thomas said quietly. "If they really couldn't accept who you are, would they have done that?" That was the question I'd been wrestling with for 2 weeks. Had my grandparents somehow known? Had they sensed my struggle and recognized it as the kind of challenge that required extra support? Or had their decision been based on other factors entirely? "I think maybe they saw someone who was working harder than she should have to fit in," I said slowly. "Someone who was sacrificing parts of herself to meet other people's expectations. The letter talks about my quiet strength and my ability to handle challenges. Maybe the challenge they saw was me trying to figure out how to be myself in a family where I wasn't sure I'd be accepted." Emma wiped tears from her eyes. "All this time, you've been going through this alone. Not alone. I had Sarah. But yes, I kept it separate from family life because I was afraid of what would happen if you knew. What about the inheritance? Jake asked. Are you going to keep it all? I looked around the room at these people who had raised me, supported me, loved me even when I was too afraid to trust them with the whole truth about who I was. No, I said firmly. Aunt Margaret came to my office today with a lawyer. She's threatening to contest the will unless I agree to split the inheritance. She wants me to take $5 million and divide the rest among Dad, Uncle Thomas, and her. $5 million is still a fortune, Dad said. It is, but that's not the point. The point is that Grandma and Grandpa made a specific choice, and they made it for reasons that I'm only beginning to understand. Maybe they saw someone who was going to need financial independence to live authentically. Maybe they recognized that traditional family structures might not provide the support I'd need. Maybe they just wanted to give me the freedom to make my own choices without worrying about money. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Boston skyline. But whatever their reasons, I don't think the answer is to hoard their gift while my family falls apart around me. What are you thinking? Emma asked. I turned back to face them. I'm thinking about setting up a trust, not the way Margaret suggested, not dividing everything equally just to keep the peace, but creating something that honors Grandma and Grandpa's intentions while also taking care of the people they loved. I pulled out a legal pad where I'd been sketching ideas for the past hour. Jake, you want to open a restaurant? What if the trust provided the capital for you to do that, with the understanding that you'd pay it back over time so other family members could pursue their dreams too? Jake's eyes widened. You'd do that? Emma, your charity is always struggling for funding. What if there was a permanent endowment that allowed you to expand your work with children? Liv, you don't have to. Mom, Dad, I know you were counting on some financial security for retirement. The trust could provide that without requiring you to wait for inheritances or worry about market fluctuations. I looked around the room. The inheritance isn't just money, it's opportunity. The opportunity for Jake to build something he's passionate about. The opportunity for Emma to help more kids. The opportunity for Mom and Dad to retire comfortably. The opportunity for me to live honestly without worrying about financial consequences. What about Aunt Margaret and Uncle Thomas? Dad asked. They'd be included too, if they want to be, but not as a bribe to avoid legal challenges. As family members who deserve to benefit from Grandma and Grandpa's legacy. Uncle Thomas leaned forward. What would you keep for yourself? Enough to be secure, to have options. Enough to move to Philadelphia if that's what I decide to do, or to stay in Boston if that's where I belong, but not so much that I become something I'm not because of money. The room was quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, not tense or angry, but thoughtful. There's something I need to know, Jake said suddenly. Did you ever think less of me? Because I struggled in school, because I couldn't find my path as easily as you and Emma did. Oh, Jake. I sat down beside him, seeing my little brother's vulnerability written across his face. Never. Not once. You're one of the most talented, creative people I know. The fact that your path looked different from mine doesn't make it less valuable. Then why did they choose you? What made you more worthy of their trust? I thought about my grandparents' letter, about all the coded language they'd used to describe qualities they'd seen in me. Quiet strength, compassion, the ability to handle challenges, living authentically according to my values. I don't think it was about worthiness, I said slowly. I think it was about need. Maybe they saw someone who was going to face challenges that the rest of the family wouldn't understand or couldn't help with. Maybe they wanted to make sure I had the resources to navigate those challenges on my own terms. Being gay, Mom said softly. You mean being gay in a family that might not accept it? Maybe. Or maybe they just saw someone who was carrying a heavy load and needed extra support. The truth is, I may never fully understand their reasoning, but I know what I want to do with their gift. I looked around the room one more time. I want to create something that would make them proud, something that takes care of the people they loved, while honoring their belief that family comes first, even when family looks different than what they expected. Dad cleared his throat. What about Sarah? Are you going to Philadelphia? The question hung in the air. In all my planning about trusts and family reconciliation, I hadn't resolved the most personal dilemma of all. I don't know yet, but whatever I decide, it won't be based on fear anymore. It'll be based on what I actually want, not what I think other people expect from me. Emma smiled through her tears. That sounds like something Grandma and Grandpa would approve of. The next 2 hours were spent working out details, asking questions, and beginning to repair relationships that had been strained to the breaking point. Jake admitted that he'd been struggling with depression and agreed to get help. Mom and Dad apologized for pressuring me about the inheritance before understanding the full situation. Uncle Thomas called Aunt Margaret and convinced her to meet with all of us before proceeding with any legal action. It wasn't a perfect resolution. There were still hurt feelings to address, logistics to work out, and family dynamics to rebuild. But for the first time in 2 weeks, I felt like we were moving forward together instead of being pulled apart by circumstances beyond our control. As everyone was getting ready to leave, Emma pulled me aside. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly, "for telling us the truth, for figuring out a way to honor Grandma and Grandpa's wishes while taking care of everyone, but mostly for trusting us enough to let us know who you really are. I'm sorry it took so long. Don't apologize. Just promise me you won't wait another 4 years to introduce us properly to Sarah, assuming you work things out with her." That night, I sat in my quiet apartment and wrote 2 letters. The first was to my family, outlining the formal proposal for the trust and the legal steps we'd need to take to make it happen. The second was to Sarah. "My love," I began, and for the first time in 4 years, I wasn't afraid to put my feelings into words without qualification or hesitation. Today I told my family about us, about you, about how much you mean to me, about the life we've built together. I told them that you're not my roommate or my friend. You're my partner, my future, the person I want to spend my life with. I know I've asked you to be patient for too long. I know I've let fear keep us in the shadows when you deserve to be celebrated. I know I've hurt you by making you feel like you were my secret instead of my joy. The inheritance from my grandparents isn't just money, it's freedom. The freedom to make choices based on love instead of fear. The freedom to build the life I actually want, instead of the life I thought other people expected from me. If the offer in Philadelphia is still open, if you still want me to come with you, then yes, I want to start fresh somewhere new, somewhere we can be ourselves from day one. I want to marry you, Sarah Martinez. I want to build something real and honest and beautiful with you, without secrets or shadows or careful management of other people's expectations. I love you, all of you, completely and without reservation, and I'm finally brave enough to say it out loud to anyone who'll listen. I sealed the letter and drove to her sister's apartment, leaving it under her car windshield wiper with a note asking her to call me when she was ready to talk. 2 days later, she did. "I got your letter," she said without preamble when I answered the phone. And I love you too, Olivia Bennett. All of you, including the brave woman who finally decided to stop hiding. Is that a yes to Philadelphia? That's a yes to everything. Philadelphia, marriage, starting over, building something real, all of it. 6 months later, I was Dr. Sarah Martinez Bennett's wife, living in a beautiful row house in Philadelphia's Rittenhouse Square neighborhood and working as a senior associate at one of the city's most progressive law firms. The Bennett Family Trust was providing seed money for Jake's restaurant, permanent funding for Emma's charity, and comfortable retirement security for my parents. Aunt Margaret had eventually agreed to participate after Uncle Thomas convinced her that contesting the will would be more expensive and destructive than working together to honor our grandparents' wishes. I still missed my grandparents every day, but I finally understood their gift. They hadn't just left me money, they'd left me permission. Permission to live authentically, to choose love over fear, to build a family that honored tradition while embracing change. The morning Sarah and I got married, in a small ceremony in Philadelphia with both our families present, I wore Grandma Helen's pearl earrings and carried a handkerchief that had belonged to Grandpa George. Emma was my maid of honor. Jake walked me down the aisle, and my parents cried happy tears as they watched their daughter marry the woman she loved. During the reception, Dad pulled me aside for a quiet moment. "Your grandparents would be so proud," he said, looking around at our combined families celebrating together. "You think so? I know so. They always said the most important thing was family, and look what you've built here. Look how you've brought everyone together." I looked around the room at Sarah's medical colleagues mixing with my extended family, at Jake enthusiastically describing his restaurant plans to anyone who'd listen, at Emma's daughters playing with Sarah's nieces and nephews. It wasn't the traditional family structure my grandparents had grown up with, but it was built on the same foundation of love and commitment they'd valued their entire lives. That night, as Sarah and I danced to our first song as wives, I thought about the letter my grandparents had left me. They'd praised me for living authentically and staying true to my values, not knowing that I'd spent years hiding the most important parts of myself. But maybe they'd seen something I couldn't see, the potential for authenticity, the strength to eventually choose truth over comfort. Their inheritance had given me more than financial security. It had given me the courage to become the person I was meant to be, surrounded by people who loved me, not despite who I was, but because of it. And in the end, that was worth more than $25 million could ever be.